Welcome to Grow Virtually, an online horticultural educational program presented by the Master Gardener Volunteers of Cobb County. Under the guidance of the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, we grow gardeners.
Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to another presentation of the Cobb County Master Gardeners Virtual Education Series. Tonight's program is called Proper Pruning in the Home Landscape. Now I'd like to welcome our speaker, UGA Cobb County Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent, Robert Trawick.
Hi, so excited to be here with everyone tonight. Pruning is something that is often done wrong in the home landscape. I think I can honestly look back to what everyone's done with crepe myrtles this year and what they've done to them and how they butchered them. And so I'm excited to be able to talk to a group of people and try to explain the biology behind pruning, to explain how cuts will affect the plant themselves and why we do those kind of cuts, and how to expect your plants to respond to those particular cuts. So without further ado, let me get into this, which is basically the program is pruning the home landscape and talking about basic tools and techniques used to do this properly and to do this well. So the overview of this is going to be talking about the purpose. What's the purpose for landscape for landscape pruning? The proper tools we use for this, techniques, timing, because timing can be so important. And as far as pruning, because of particularly flowering plants, when do we prune particular plants that flower, and pruning specific plant groups. So without further ado, pruning is an important cultural practice. The reasons that we prune either can be related to training or directing growth. It can be to control size and shape. It can also improve the overall quality or health of the plant. So the first T of pruning, there's like a group of T's we refer to. The first T of pruning is tools. What type of tools do we use? So the main pruners that I particularly use are hand pruners. There's also lopping shears, pruning saws, pole pruners, and head shears. So you can see a nice example of all these particular tools, and going over what are the type of tools that we can use. When I mentioned chainsaw can actually be a tool of pruning. There's a type of pruning we'll get into in just a little bit called severe renewal pruning or renewal pruning. Me personally, I had some Yopon hollies that I had in the front of my house that had been growing for the past 30 plus years that had just gotten out of shape. And believe it or not, I cut those back down, doing the right timing to make sure and I used a chainsaw to get those actually down. Then I finished it up with some other pruning tools. So hand pruners cut small twigs and branches up to about a ½ inch in diameter. They have a scissor-like action. They're draw cut pruners. The blades cut by gliding against a sharp, thicker blade. They're very similar to scissors, if you think about it that way. They cut all the way through. They do cost a little bit more, and they make close, smooth, well cuts that can heal properly. The other hand pruners that you'll typically see out there on the market are these type of anvil or snap cut pruners, where a blade cuts against a broad, flattened, grooved blade. The one thing about these anvil action pruners is that they make have a tendency to make large cuts a little bit easier. Lopping shears are what we use to cut branches that are between a ½ inch and 1½ inches in diameter. So our larger diameter plant material we want to cut through. They have a large blade with long handles. Those larger handles help increase leverage to be able to really get in there and cut. So instead of using your hand to make these scissor-like cuts, you're using your arms. They cut in one smooth stroke to avoid branch injury. And they're extremely helpful to those with arthritis or those of people who lack some hand strength to be able to make those cuts with hand pruners. A pruning saw is a great tool for branches larger than 1.5 inches in diameter. Narrower blade, coarser teeth than a typical regular saw. Curved blades cut on the draw. So when you pull towards it, that's when it's doing the cutting action. The shape of the handle, there are a lot of different ones out there. The shape of the handle can be completely according to your personal preference. Pole pruners are for those trees or for those to remove, larger branches from trees, especially higher up in elevation. Using both a cutting blade and a saw. If you'll look at this one in particular, on the right side where the little cursor is, it has something very similar to a pruners that will actually make a cut. On the other side, we have exactly a saw blade that does a good job of cutting and making action. With the pruners, there's usually, like I said, this rope that's attached to it, so you can get it up there on top of a branch. You kind of wrap the rope around your hand, you pull down, and you can make a pruning action type cut with the rope and take those limbs off. It does have a telescoping. They usually almost always have a telescoping type of extension like this, so you can actually get pretty far up into a tree and make pruning cuts further up. Because, I think all of us would agree that getting up on a ladder and trying to make cuts with a saw can be a little bit dangerous. So these work very, very well in that respect. Head shears, they come in both manual, as you see up here, and gasoline powered or electric head shears, as you see in the other picture. Basically, they shear or clip plants neatly for a nice trimmed appearance. These are typically used in a much more formalized type of landscape. They do not cut large branches, and to be honest, the type of pruning we're going to discuss tonight, called thinning, is much better for the plant than shearing, and we'll get into the biology behind that as we move along. So as far as cleaning and care of pruners, routine cleaning is a must. Use steel wool or wire brushes to remove any rust or debris. Wash in warm soapy water to clean or dry these guys. Sharpen only the outer surfaces of the blades, and then sharpen in oil blades each season. A big thing is when you're pruning, you can sit there and have some disease that is on this particular plant. Boxwoods are something that immediately come to mind because there's a disease called boxwood blight. And because of this, what you want to make sure you do is disinfect between prunings, because oftentimes if we sit there and prune with pruners into a diseased plant, that the pruners can actually become a vector of disease, just like an insect would or anything else. So we want to sit there and disinfect these pruners in between plants using alcohol, or you can use household bleach, which 1 part to 10 parts of water, you can actually sterilize the pruners in between cuts. So getting into the second T of pruning, we're talking about technique. So we started with tools, now we're moving on to technique. The big thing here is we're getting into the biology of this. Now, this is a terminal bud. And this particular terminal bud, what you got to understand about that is that terminal bud produces a plant hormone called auxin. Auxin is a plant hormone that, if you've ever heard of dip and grow or used these dip and grow type products to root plants, it's the same exact material. Auxin can be used for rooting cuttings, but it also is produced by these terminal buds to basically keep these lateral dormant buds from ever really doing anything. As long as this terminal bud exists, it's producing this auxin, which keeps these buds from ever popping out or sprouting. So we want to keep that in mind because that's a big part of the biology of this. Typically, new growth occurs within 6 to 8 inches of the cut. And whenever you prune a terminal bud back, it can cause these other lateral buds to start sprouting out. Oftentimes people refer to those as suckers. But when you're cutting back, you want to cut back to another bud. So this particular bud can take over producing that auxin to keep all these other lateral buds or dormant buds from popping out and doing anything. So when we make cuts, what we want to do is go back close to another lateral bud, just like this, and we want to make a good angular cut. Typically, about a 45-degree angle is considered a really good cut. That keeps water from just dropping on top of here and really getting in and causing any disease to come in there. One that's more of like a 30-degree cut or something narrower than a 45-degree angle is too angular. You do not want to cut too close to the bud. You don't want to make a cut right in here because that's just not going to allow that bud to form any structural wood there. And you also don't want to leave too much up here at the top because then you end up leaving an area where you have where disease can get in there and cause a lot of issues. You end up with a kind of a dead tip. So talking about trees, when we're talking about larger cuts on trees, a big thing that you need to remember is a 3-cut method. So the first cut is just you can kind of see it right here, just a little bit of a cut on the underside of the branch. If you see this right here, you want to make just a little, almost just a notch. What you're trying to do is cut through that cambium on the lower part of the branch. The second cut you do on the outside of that little first cut you did from underneath. You want to take that and cut it down. The reason you want to make that first cut is because if you were to do the second cut first, what can happen is it can break down here, and then it can end up peeling all that cambium, that outer layer of tissue. It can literally pull that and just strip it down the entire side of the tree. So you always want to make that first cut underneath, do the second cut all the way through, and then the third cut is going to be right here near the bark ridge. So if you look down here, you can see these ripples, and on crepe myrtles, it's very easy to see. You can see it very readily. You'll have these rippled areas where a branch comes out. And what you want to do is cut just on the outside of that collared tissue. You do not want to make a flush cut. You want to cut just on the outside of that branch collared tissue. And that's because basically this collared tissue is, I think of it honestly as almost like stem cells. It is what's referred to as meristematic tissue. This is, I guess, in a stem cell kind of way, it's one of those things where it's tissue that doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up, if that makes any sense. So when you cut on the outside and leave that collar tissue intact, what ends up happening is that collar tissue ends up closing the wound right around here all by itself. It completely seals in and closes it. I'm gonna go ahead and mention it now. I might mention it a little bit, but pruning paints, things like that, are completely useless. The trees and shrubs will actually close these wounds all by themselves if you make a proper pruning cut. So when we're talking about heading back or thinning, shearing can be considered what this is, what's considered heading back. So when we make these cuts just like this, what ends up happening is you've cut all those terminal buds off. And when you cut these terminal buds off, all these dormant lateral buds will basically just start popping out and growing. Like I said, we often consider these or call these suckers. And these suckers are very superficially attached to the plant. You can almost walk up to one and pull it off. I think almost all of us have seen people shear boxwoods. You shear them on both the upside, the sides and the top. And you go back about 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, and it looks like you never even pruned them to begin with. It's because those superficial lateral buds, as soon as you make those heading cuts and auxin is not being produced, all these lateral buds start popping out, and that can actually, like I said, increase your workload. You can end up having to go back and keep shearing these and pruning these. The best way to do this is thinning, which is going back into the canopy. And what you do is you prune where a point of origin is, where it intersects with another branch. You follow it back in, you make these cuts where these where a branch intersects with another. Very quickly, you can reduce the size of a shrub by making these thinning cuts. You can bring it down. And a benefit of that is you keep a very natural shape, this natural shape of the shrub, instead of having this very formalized look. So the heading, again, removes the terminal portion of shoots or limbs. It removes those terminal buds. It stimulates all that regrowth near the cuts. It causes all those lateral dormant buds that would never do anything to re-sprout out. It is a very invigorating type of cut, but at the same time, a lot of this growth you're going to be getting back from that cut is not growth you want. It creates a very thick, compacted growth form, and you can literally sit there and look at these guys right here. When you prune these back, you end up getting this huge jump of growth, and you lose that natural form. So thinning, again, keeps a much more natural appearance. It opens the middle of the plant for sunlight. What that does is it allows more air movement through the plant, which reduces disease, exponentially. And again, it's a less invigorating type of pruning. So instead of having to sit there and prune a plant, one time a year, you end up having to prune this thing every 4 to 6 weeks if you make these heading cuts on the more formalized pruning. So again, thinning, you want to drop crotch cut. It reduces the size of larger trees. It helps to remove these main branches. Again, if you see right here where that branch collar exists, right here, you make these cuts. You remove that, and then this guy right here becomes the new leader. So cutting back to a large lateral branch, you end up being able to shape these particular plants rather than having them get out of control. And again, if they're large limbs, you want to go back to that tree cut method, which is that 3-cut, the underneath, to make sure you don't strip any cambium away. Now, crepe myrtles, again, probably the most abused plant I think any of us have ever seen. I've heard it referred to as crepe murder. What ends up happening is these guys. So thinning crepe myrtles, it helps reduce some of these multiple trunks. As you can see, these are actually, you can actually find crepe myrtles that are referred to as standards that have just a one trunk or a couple of trunks. But when you go in before you keep the same height, crepe myrtles are a plant, in all honesty, that range in sizes from Pocomoke and Chickasaw varieties that only get 2 feet tall, up to Natchez and Tuscarora that can get up to 35 40 feet tall, if not taller. And then the varieties are every size in between. So a big thing about crepe myrtles is pick a variety that's only going to get the size for the area that you want. Like I said, there are crepe myrtles out there that only get 6 to 8 feet tall. There are varieties that only get 8 to 10 feet tall. Pick the right variety and literally leave it at the height it's supposed to get, and then go in here and make your thinning cuts through here to just have a nice shaped single plant. Again, this is what happens. And I think if we drove around town right now, we'd see these guys all over town. This causes extreme thick, dense growth. Like I was talking about earlier, the buds where this growth comes out, they're very superficially attached. I'd be willing to bet you could go out, when new growth comes out, you could literally almost strip it completely off of the plant just by pulling on it, because it's not very attached to inner wood. It also increases issues of disease, insects. A stressed plant will be much more susceptible to diseases, insects than a healthy plant will. And again, for half the year, they're going to be unsightly. They're going to look terrible. The best thing to do is avoid this at all costs. Now, renewal pruning, like what I talked about earlier with my Yopon hollies I did at home, is an extreme form of heading. And for plants that have overgrown their planting space, you can literally, for a lot of species, not all, but for a lot of species, you can cut these guys back within 6 to 12 inches of the ground. And then you start pruning when that new, when you do this, it's right about when spring growth begins. So again, like I told you, I did mine probably about 2 weekends ago, so that we'll get that new flush of growth. The third T of pruning is extremely important, particularly for flowering plants, and that's timing. So we want to prune our spring flowering plants after they bloom. I kind of refer to this in my own mind as a May rule. So if plants bloom May and before that, so azaleas are a great example of that. So plants that bloom May and before, you prune after they have bloomed. You don't want to prune these guys before they bloom because they've already set their flower buds from the previous summer and fall. So if you go out pruning azaleas in February, you're going to end up cutting all those flower buds off. For plants that bloom after May, June, July, August, and think crepe myrtles here, that's you prune them during the dormant winter season or the end of it, getting into like late February, early March. That's when you're going to do some pruning on these guys. So plants, spring flowering plants that you prune after flowering, again, azaleas, big leaf hydrangeas, Bradford pear. I left this on here, prune to ground level. I despise Bradford pears. They need to go. If you have one, find another plant. Bradford pears are actually an invasive. They have extremely weak branching structure. So avoid Bradford pear at all costs. But Rattlereath spirea, clematis, double file viburnum, dogwoods, these are plants that you typically prune after flowering. Some more are witch hazel, wisteria, daphne, redbud, pyracantha, oakleaf hydrangea, and Japanese pieris. So you prune these after flowering. So oakleaf hydrangeas are not going to bloom in the summer. So you prune these, get that done then. Flowering trees, shrubs, and vines that you prune before spring growth begins. So again, that after May, beautyberry, camellia, the lilac chase tree, which is oftentimes referred to as a vitax, crepe myrtles, tea olives. These are plants and shrubs that we're going to prune at the beginning of spring, late February, early March. That's when we're going to start pruning these guys. Others are Glossophilia, hedges like I would say Chinese hollies, Nandina, sweet shrub, viburnum. These are other plants that we're going to prune before that spring growth begins. As far as deciduous shade and flowering trees, we need to train them early. We want to get one central trunk. You want a good one central leader with strong lateral branches. This is a big thing, you know, as far as just getting the good shape of the tree. You want the major limbs beginning about 5 feet above the ground. So limbs growing at a narrow angle to the trunk. So anything that's 45 degrees, I'd say a little bit less than 45 degrees, 30-degree angles. We want to trim these, you know, and get these off, because what ends up happening when you have very narrow angles with branches next to each other, basically you end up with branches growing against branches, and as they grow, they almost grow themselves to split. The Bradford pear is a perfect example of this. If you look at a Bradford pear and wonder why they all split when they get 20, 25 years old, it's because they have those very narrow angles of attachment. And when you get all that bark growing against bark, what you're finding out is that over time, as it grows, it's literally growing itself to split. This is a good example of branches growing inward. You can kind of see this up here and talk about that, you know, what I was talking about, that bark growing against bark. When you have this, that limb is destined to fail. Again, you can see, you know, branches that are damaged by insects or diseases. You start seeing a lot of lichens on branches like this that aren't in proportion to the trunk itself. Those are, you know, and you see that very, you know, narrow angle. That's a good branch to take off. Again, you know, annually remove or prune water sprouts. And again, usually when we see water sprouts, these are those adventitious buds that I would be willing to bet if you go further down here, what you'd find is that there was a heading cut down here that caused all of these lateral buds to sprout up and cause all these branches to pop out like that. So what you want to do is go in and remove some of these lateral shoots, these water sprouts, because they can grow extremely fast. They get heavy very quickly. And when they, and it doesn't take much to remove them. As far as pruning deciduous shade and flowering trees, again, you know, when we come to a tree, you don't want 3 leaders here. With a tree, you want one central straight leader going up. So pruning back to a point of origin for these 2 guys, you can select one central leader that will keep going up. The other one here, branches that grow inward on each other. Let me see here. You know, when you have branches that are rubbing against each other, they have a tendency to grow, and over time they can split. When you have suckers that are coming out from the base, from the roots, those are you know, those are branches you want to remove. And then low growing branches that interfere with any kind of maintenance, right here, those are branches that you'll want to remove. Again, you bring them back to that point of origin while leaving that branch collar intact. So typically broadleaf evergreens require little or no pruning. They develop a natural symmetric growth habit. Magnolias and hollies, the tree form hollies, are good examples of these. I'll be honest with you, with magnolias, I always suggest people leave them limbed all the way down to the ground. And a big reason for that is when these leaves drop off, you know, they don't decay or break down very rapidly. So if you leave those limbs all the way down to the ground, no one's the wiser when all those leaves are underneath the actual, you know, tree. You do want to prune early to prevent multiple trunks or multiple leaders. Again, with trees, we always want that central one leader. And again, annual pruning is typically not recommended. For deciduous and broadleaf evergreen shrubs, shearing encourages that dense outer canopy. And it really ends up with extreme sparse foliage inside. The uniform shapes make landscapes very monotonous, that very formalized habit. Thin dwarf shrubs instead of shearing. Go in and prune back to those points of origin, and you'll end up with a much more natural shape as far as is concerned. Pruning requirements for larger shrubs absolutely depends on age, the growth habit, the vigor of the plant, flowering time. Again, think back to that May rule, and the location of where that shrub is. Azaleas, again, prune after blooming. No pruning after mid-July. That is when they're starting to set those buds for next year. And use hand pruners. Don't shear azaleas. One of the worst things you can do to an azalea is shearing them. The japonica camellias require very little pruning. The sasanqua camellias, you want to thin versus shearing them. You want to prune the fall and winter blooms in early March. And the japonicas, which are the spring bloomers, prune them after they bloom. Sasanquas typically always bloom in the fall. Japonica camellias can bloom during fall, winter, or early spring. So kind of keep that in mind. Hydrangeas. This is always a big thing as far as hydrangeas. When do we prune these guys? For the macrophylla, which literally means in Latin big leaf, or mop head hydrangeas, you know, prune those guys typically, you know, before that spring growth, or after that spring growth begins. I'm sorry. Hydrangea macrophylla, normally the lace cap hydrangeas. There are some really great varieties like Twist and Shout, Blue Wave. The nice thing about these newer varieties is they actually bloom on both old wood and new wood. The Hydrangea quercifolia, which actually quercia is oak, folia means leaf, so oak leaf hydrangeas, you want to prune those, you know, just like what we talked about earlier. So there's some really neat selections of the oak leaf hydrangea. A lot of them depend on the overall height and width these guys get, but there's some really neat selections like Ruby Slippers and Snowflake that are great hydrangeas to look into. So hydrangeas that bloom on new growth. So these are our paniculata hydrangeas, like Limelight, Pinky Winky. So these are hydrangeas that we prune early spring. So again, going back to macrophylla, we prune them separately, differently after they flower. These are guys that we prune before they flower. So others are the arborescens or the smooth hydrangea. Those can be like, you'll see these at most of your local garden centers, like Pike. So Annabelle, Invincible Spirit. Again, these are pruned late winter, early spring. I know in my front yard, I have Limelight. I have another variety called Strawberry Sunday, and then another variety called Vanilla Strawberry. that are paniculata hydrangeas. These are the ones that like the full sun. These are the ones that you can handle full sun. These are the guys that, like, I think it was last weekend or the weekend before last, I went out and I pruned them all the way back, got them into a size and shape that I kind of wanted, and they will sit there and produce their flowers on their new growth. A big thing as far as hedges is the formal versus informal, or sheared versus natural. If you are going to do some formal shearing, a big thing to make sure is that you have somewhat of a pyramidal shape where this top is narrower than the bottom. If the top is wider than the bottom, what's going to end up happening is the sides are going to end up being shaded out. As long as the top is narrower than the bottom, basically the sides will continue to get full sun. So you'll have a full shrub. But if the top is wider than the bottom, the sides are going to end up getting shaded out, and you'll end up with almost basically looking at stems on the side and green on top. As far as conifers are concerned, so talking about pine trees, other things like that, they're upright growing plants. They have extreme symmetrical growing habits. They can become large but require little pruning. Most conifers actually are self-pruning. If you've ever noticed a pine tree, they have all the growth a lot of times at the top. The sides are bare because they are self-pruning. You want to remove half the new shoots while in the candle stage, which is the very tip growth. If you want to prune these guys back, you're going to prune right at the very tips, but you never want to cut back into hardened older wood, because these conifers just do not respond well to those types of cuttings. Junipers are very similar, upright and broad spreading junipers. You can make thinning cuts to reduce the size, but do not severely prune these, like that type of pruning I was talking about earlier, that renewal pruning or severe renewal pruning. You do not want to do that. They do not respond well to that at all. They will actually, if you cut these off severely, you basically killed the plant. You want to reduce length of branches by cutting back, again, just like our thinning cuts, back to some lateral branches. Some vines and ground covers, completely depends on the bigger growth habit spread. Flowering vines, you want to prune summer blooming vines before new growth begins. Again, think back to that May rule. You also want to, prune spring blooming vines after they bloom. So follow that May rule. As far as when to prune. As far as ground covers, you want to prune before spring growth begins. And again, prune for 3 reasons: to thin the canopy, to keep within their bounds, and to rejuvenate after any winter damage or burning of foliage. These are some great resources here that UGA has. If you go to the extension.uga.edu/publications website, you can literally find innumerable publications on everything horticulture related, but Bulletin 949 and Bulletin 961 are 2 great publications that go into even more detail as far as basic pruning of woody plants and pruning of ornamental plants in the landscape. Please don't hesitate to contact the Cobb County Extension Office if you have any questions. We're there to help from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. You can call the Master Gardener Help Desk. We typically always have a Master Gardener there that is more than willing to answer your questions. The phone number is, again, 770-528-4070. And again, that can get you to the Master Gardener Help Desk, or it can even get you to some of us, that work there, and we can help answer your questions. And again, we're located at 678 South Cobb Drive, not far from the Cobb Water Department on the second floor. If you want to email any pictures or anything like that, use the uge1067@uga.edu email address, and we will always get back to you to help you out with any questions you have. We're more than happy to help.
We hope that you will find our information informative and helpful. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.